Hi everybody, this is Ann. We published a video a while back where I threw a popcorn bowl and altered it so the bottom became a kernel catcher. I had quite a few people not comfortable with wheel throwing ask me to design a similar project but for hand building. Using a popcorn bag as inspiration, I came up with an easy, elegant solution for it that I hope you'll like. I designed these templates for the project. Jim has posted a link to them in the description section under the video. I rolled out a 1/4-inch slab and ribbed it smooth using a damp rubber rib on both sides. I cut out 4 of the large template pieces, 4 of the smaller rectangular templates, 1 of the square templates, plus I cut an extra slab I thought would be larger than the bottom of the bucket. One of the biggest keys to success for this project is to set these aside until they've dried to leather hard. I'll use the 45-degree edge of my beveling tool to bevel the edges. Holding the beveler straight to the table and against the long edge of one of the big slabs, I pulled it slowly down the side to cut the clay. I spun around the slab and repeated this step along the opposite long edge. I beveled all of the 4 large slabs in this manner. Remember to save all your cuttings for future use. Keep them covered so they don't dry out. Starting with the first 2 large slabs, I scored each of the beveled edges with my scoring tool. I slipped one of the connecting edges, then lifted it up and butted it in place next to the first slab. As it's leather hard, it should hold its shape. If it doesn't hold its shape, it's not ready yet. Let it dry a little longer. I placed one of the bevel cuttings between the 2 slabs for an elegant angle and worked all the clay in the seam together well, inside and outside. I repeated those steps of scoring, slipping, and connecting the next large slab in place using the straight edge of the table to make sure I kept my line straight. I placed another of the cuttings into the seam, making sure to get a good seal from the top to the bottom. You may want to add a little ball of clay at the top and bottom to make sure they're tightly sealed and not vulnerable to cracking. To connect the 4th wall, I'll be working upside down so the piece is in a pyramid position. Again, I made sure the beveled edges were scored well and slipped. I positioned the slab so the edges of both walls were in line with the new wall. Then I used my finger to begin the joining process. I zipped up the walls along the outside really well. I then placed one of the long trimmings into the inner seam. It's hard to get my hand into the piece at this point, so I'll use a wetted blunt end of a paintbrush to get it started in place. Once the bottom parts of the seams were tight, it was stable enough to turn over the bucket and work the top part of both seams together. I made sure to really re-enhance the top rim where it will be most vulnerable to cracking upon drying. Once the interior of the bucket is tight together, I used a rubber rib over each seam to make sure I didn't push those sides apart when working on the inside. Like Goldilocks, always looking for the point where things are just right, the key to creating a tight seal and keeping the integrity of the shape is to put just enough pressure against the clay without distorting your straight edge. For the bottom, I laid out that slab that I described earlier in the video that I cut out and let dry to leather hard along with the other template pieces. I set the bucket form on top of it. I lightly traced around the bottom edge. I picked up the bucket and scored the inside of that traced line of the slab and along the bottom of the bucket. I slipped the scored area along the slab really well. I then attached the bucket form to the slab. I used a paintbrush to start sealing on the outside of the seam. I used more of the bevel cuttings to seal the inside of the bucket floor seams all the way around. Then I used an old paintbrush to make sure there was a good seal between all of that clay. I rolled some very small coils and worked them into the seams along the outside of the bucket to ensure that I have a tight seal there. I really worked that into the seam until it was smooth. I used a needle tool to carefully cut the excess clay away. I turned over the bucket and used my needle tool to trim the rest of the overhanging clay away from the bottom, making sure the bottom was squared off and in line with the walls. You may want to check it with an L-squared ruler. And here's my finished bucket. All my lines are straight and squared up. The inner edges are sealed tight. Now let's move on to making the removable kernel catcher. And this is where we'll use those 4 smaller rectangular sides and squared template slab. Following a lot of the steps we did before, I beveled the angled smaller edges of each of the 4 rectangular slabs, spinning them around and mirroring the cuts along the other short angled edge. For the first 2 sides, I scored and slipped one edge, then turned one side up and attached the 2 edges together from the outside, making sure it was straight and even. Again, I used the trimmings that I had cut along the inner edge in the joint. I repeated these steps along the 3rd side of the catcher. I stood those 3 sides up and again repeated the steps to score, slip, and attach the 2 remaining edges together. I made sure to place the cuttings along the inner joints and work them in well. Now I'm going to attach the squared slab to the wider side of the catcher. I scored the top edge and the bottom inner edge of the square. I slipped the edges like before, then attached the top and the bottom together. I used my finger and a wet paintbrush to start the joining process on the outside. I placed trimmings along the inner joint on all 4 sides, really making sure of a good fit. I like to use my fingernail to get a good seal, but a paintbrush can work too. And don't forget to reinforce each of the joints along the 4 corners along the bottom edge with a little extra clay. Now this will ultimately fit inside the popcorn bucket, but the sides of the bucket are angled, so I'm using my needle tool against the side of the catcher to cut off a little bit of the squared off edge so the edges are now angled. As the clay is leather hard, go slow so as to not chip off any edges. I burnish the clay along the edges with my fingers so they're more rounded and angled and will have a better, tighter fit inside the bucket. I want to cut holes for my fingers to grip the catcher for easy removal, so I used my thumb as a template and traced around it along one of the corners. I also drew a half circle along the other 2 edges to join that traced line. I used my needle tool to carefully cut that out. I used my needle tool to clean up the excess dregs from the inside of that cut and bevel that edge. I burnished the clay outside and inside that hole with a wet finger. I repeated these steps along the opposing edge, so now I have 2 finger grips so the catcher can be lifted easily. Just make sure your fingers fit inside the holes with a little extra leeway for shrinkage. Now I can set that inside the bucket and make sure that I have a good fit. If your catcher's a bit too big to slide to the bottom, you can always trim away more clay where you need to. To create the holes for the kernels to slide through, I'll be using this medium-sized hole puncher. You can create your own cool pattern, but I thought I'd start in the center and work my way out. I punched out the first hole by twisting down through the leather-hard clay. From experience on the last popcorn bowl, I learned that I needed a bit bigger hole due to how much the porcelain shrinks. I enlarged the hole using the blunt end of one of my tools. I just slowly twisted it down. I can clean up the extra clay ridge when the clay is bone dry. And here's an example of one I made earlier that is dried to bone dry when I trimmed it down and sponged the holes to clean them up. For fun, I thought I'd get creative with the bucket shape and alter the rim so it would be more inviting. I folded a piece of paper in half and traced a simple flower shape along the crease. I placed it along the top edge of the bucket and traced the flower shape along the side. I connected lines from the protruding petal curving upward to the rim. I did this on either side of the flower. Using an X-Acto knife, I cut the extra clay away from the rim, making sure I went slow so as not to crack the clay. Now that's a much more dynamic design and still functional. I wet my fingers and burnished around all the edges to make sure there were no sharp burrs. I continued this around the entire popcorn bucket rim. Now you can let both the bucket and the catcher dry separately. And here's one that I made earlier. The flower shape looks so Art Deco to me, so I divided the bucket up into sections and painted them black with light sgraffito lines on the flower. And here it is all finished. I glazed it using my white liner glaze on the inside and on all the white parts. I used Amico Obsidian Celadon glaze over the black underglaze and fired it to cone 5 for this dynamic look. The catcher still fits nicely into the bucket and the holes are big enough for the kernels to fit through. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. In any case, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and we'll see you next time in the studio.